Hello, listeners. This video discusses She Stoops to Conquer, a comedy written by Oliver Goldsmith. The play was first performed in London in the year 1773. In the English speaking world and in English literature, this play is a favorite for study. This play is one of the few plays from the 18th century to have retained its appeal and is still regularly performed. The events in this play take place in one long night, and this play was initially titled as Mistakes of a Night. John O'Keefe in the year 1778 wrote a loose sequel for this play, and the loose sequel titled Tawny Lumpkin in Town. This play has got a famous English phrase, ask me no questions and I'll tell you no lies. Let's look about the author, who's Oliver Goldsmith, born in the year 1728 and died in the year 1774. He was a well-known Anglo-Irish novelist, playwright, dramatist, and poet, and he's noted for his novels The Vicar of Wakefield, The Deserted Village, The Good-Natured Man, The History of Little Goody Two Shoes, and She Stoops to Conquer. He was educated from Trinity College, Dublin, and he got his MD from the University of Edinburgh. He belongs to the literary movement, The Club, which is a London dining club founded in 1764 by the artist Joshua Reynolds and the essayist Samuel Johnson. Goldsmith's readable style earned him the respect of more prominent writers, including the philosopher Edmund Burke and Samuel Johnson, who's an essayist who composed the English language's first high-quality dictionary. Let's have a look at the historical context or the background of this play, She Stoops to Conquer. This play takes place during a peaceful reign of King George III, which was a time of social metamorphosis for Britain. At that time, there was the agricultural revolution, which increases in agricultural production and a massive consolidation of farmland. Wealthy elite urban cities were formed. Cosmopolitanism began to develop among cities. This play belongs to the genre laughing comedy or comedy of manners. This has a setting of a small town in the English countryside during the Georgian era, which was 18th century. The play was first published in 1773 and it was written in London, England. The written year was 1771. Let us see the characters of this play. Charles Marlow. He's an aristocratic, well-educated, and a handsome young man. He has spent little time in polite society. Marlow has spent most of his time in school and in international travel than spending of his time in polite society. And as a result of this, he lacks self-confidence in social settings and he freezes up around women of his own class. He's incredibly nervous too. He finds comfortable with low-class women because with whom he finds it easier to converse. Kate Hardcastle, she's an intelligent, good-humored, sensible, and a beautiful young woman. She's more confident in her own merits. She is appreciative of the good in others. She loves and respects her father, Hardcastle. She is interested in the fashion of her day, and she does not define herself by how she dresses. She's got a flexible attitude towards self-presentation. Most of the women of her age look for husband, but Kate is interested in finding someone handsome and intelligent and who is settling down. And so she's excited when her father tells about Marlow. Marlow is the son of her father's old friend who is about to pay them a visit to make her acquaintance. Constance Neville, who's a young woman of marriageable age, She's a kind, affectionate, and a practical woman. And since the death of her father, her aunt, Mrs. Hardcastle, wants Constance to marry her son, Tony, who has served as her guardian. Meanwhile, Constance is in love with Hastings but does not want to marry without her aunt's permission because this would mean foregoing the jewels she is supposed to inherit. George Hastings, who's a fashionable, well educated, and good mannered boy, Hastings is Marlow's best friend and Constance's suitor. Unlike Marlow, Hastings is unconstrained in social situations and does not take fashion too seriously. Hastings tries to encourage his friend to gain confidence so that he can build a real relationship with a woman he respects. Hastings is a romantic and who's willing to give up Constance's fortune to marry her immediately. Hardcastle, he's an old fashioned gentleman who owns an old house in the countryside and he's stuck in his own ways and despises modern trends. He was found in the War of Spanish Succession and likes to tell stories of his time during the war. And he's more protective of his daughter Kate. He's indulgent to his wife Mrs. Hardcastle and disapproves of his unpolished and rowdy stepson, who's Tony. Though he dislikes modern society, he leads a relatively isolated life. He is a man who expects to be treated with respect by everyone that he meets. He is upset by the ill treatment that he receives from his friend, Sir Charles' son, Marlow. Mrs. Hardcastle, she's a vain, greedy, sentimental, and a manipulative woman. She has lived all her life in the countryside but is obsessed with what is fashionable in the city. She has spoiled her son Tony. She wants to take control of him as long as possible. She's a guardian of her niece Constance, whose father and mother are dead, and she hopes to force her to marry Tony to keep Constance's fortune in the family. Tony Lumpkin, who's otherwise called Esquire, he's a clever but uneducated and a rustic man. He is sick of his mother, Mrs. Hardcastle, who's a domineering personality. She waits for the time that when Tony will inherit a substantial fortune. Tony has never gone to school as a child. He passes his time by drinking with lower class men from the area. He plays pranks with his own family members and he makes up humorous songs. His stepfather, Hardcastle, disapproves of his behavior. Tony wants to marry a rustic woman from his area who's named as Bed Bouncer, but his mother hopes to convince him to marry his cousin, Constance. So, which will keep Constance's fortune in the family? Aunt Pettigrew, who is Constance's aunt, who lives a 2-hour drive away from the Hardcastles. Mrs. Hardcastle intends to send Constance to Aunt Pettigrew when she learns that Constance hopes to elope with Hastings. Let us now learn the summary of this play. The play has a prologue and it has 5 acts. It ends with epilogue 1 and 2. David Garrick, he is a famous actor and theoretical producer. He wrote the prologue, which was originally recited by an actor who refused to play the part of Tony. So in the prologue, he tells the audience that Goldsmith's play is meant to rescue comedy. He personifies comedy as a sick woman. The prologue suggests the play that follows is the cure prescribed to her by a doctor who's the playwright. And if the audience likes the play, then the doctor's prescription can be said to have worked and comedy will be saved. Let's now look into the 5 acts and then we'll deal the epilogue 1 and 2. So Act 1 begins at the Hardcastle's home in the countryside. Mrs. Hardcastle complains to her husband that they never leave their rural home to see the new things that's happening in the city. Hardcastle says he loves everything old, including his own old wife. Mrs. Hardcastle responds by saying that she was a young old woman when she had her first husband's son, Tony, and he is not even yet 21. Hearing this, Hardcastle even more gets angry and complains about Tony because Tony behaves in an immature way, because Tony loves to prank his family members, which was disliked by Hardcastle. Meanwhile, Tony enters on his way to a pub and his mother follows him off stage, begging him to stay and spend time with them. Hardcastle's daughter, who's named as Kate, she enters the stage. Now the father Hardcastle, he remarks on her fashionable clothing, which he dislikes, but Kate reminds him of their deal. She wears what she likes in the morning and dresses in the old-fashioned style, which her father prefers at night. At this time, Hardcastle reveals a big news to her that his friend Sir Charles' son, Marlow, is coming to visit their place, and Hardcastle hopes Kate and Marlow will marry. Hardcastle says Marlow has a reputation for being handsome, intelligent, and very modest. Now, hearing this, Kate likes all and she's thinking about it to make a good impression on Marlow. Hardcastle exits, leaving Kate to think over about her visitor Marlow. Now she is joined by her cousin Constance, whom she tells about Marlow's impending visit. Constance tells her that she knows Marlow. She tells that he is a friend of her suitor Hastings. She also adds up more details about Marlow, that he is terribly shy around upper class women and therefore often seduces lower class women. Mrs. Hardcastle wants Constance to marry her cousin Tony so that Constance inherited jewels stay in the family. Constance informs Kate that she only pretends to be willing to marry Tony so that Mrs. Hardcastle won't suspect that she loves Hastings. Constance was happy to know that Tony doesn't like to marry Constance. Now the entire scene changes to a bar where Tony is drinking with a group of lower class men. The bar's owner informed that two fashioned looking men have arrived who say that they are looking for Mr. Hardcastle's house. Now Tony realizes that this must be Marlow and decides to trick Marlow into believing Hardcastle's house is an inn. Act 2 begins with Hardcastle trying to teach his servants on how to behave in front of his guests. Soon after, Marlow and Hastings arrive at what they believe to be an inn. Here, Hardcastle enters and tries to engage his guest in conversation, but the two men ignore what he says, believing him to be a lowly innkeeper. Hardcastle is believing that Marlow is his friend's son, and he is shocked by the rude behavior of Marlow. Marlow insists on being shown his room, so Hardcastle accompanies him. When Hastings is left alone, Constance enters, who is a lover of Hastings, and upon hearing that Hastings believes he is in an inn, Constance guesses that it is a trick played by Tony. Hastings also keeps this a secret from Marlow because if Marlow learns the truth, he may quickly leave the inn. Hastings also urges Constance to elope with him, but she is reluctant to lose her fortune, which is the jewels, which she will only inherit if she marries with her aunt's permission. She promises to run away with him once she has the jewels. Marlow now returns to Hastings complaining about Hardcastle, saying that Hardcastle is not leaving him alone. Hastings tells Marlowe that by coincidence, Constance and her cousin Kate are both now at the inn. Hearing this, Marlowe freezes in anxiety. Kate enters and tries to engage Marlowe in conversation, but once Hastings and Constance leave Kate and Marlowe alone, Marlowe is too nervous to complete his sentence. Also, he is nervous to look at Kate's face. He ends the conversation abruptly and rushes off to his room. Kate, after a conversation with Marlowe, she reflects to herself that Marlowe is not a shy man, and so she is interested in him. Tony and Constance enter, followed by Hastings and Mrs. Hardcastle. Constance makes a show of flirting with Tony from Mrs. Hardcastle while he tries to repel her advances. Hastings also meets Tony and informs him that he loves Constance and wants to elope with her. Hearing this, Tony is thrilled and promises to help the couple in the way that he can. Act 3 begins with Hardcastle and Kate comparing their very different impressions on Marlowe. After few attempts of encountering Marlowe, Kate decides or understands that Marlowe is never bold and he is incredibly shy. She now talks about this to her father, and she convinces her father that she would give Marlowe another chance to see what his true character is. Tony presents Hastings with a box containing Constance's jewels, which he stole from his mother's drawers. Constance and Mrs. Hardcastle enter, and Hastings exists now. Constance tries to convince her aunt to let her try on her jewels, but Mrs. Hardcastle will not relent. Now, Tony asks his mother to tell Constance that her jewels are missing. Now, hearing this, it upsets Constance deeply. But Tony reassures Constance privately that he gave her jewels to Hastings, who is preparing for their elopement. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hastings has discovered that the jewels are really missing. Kate is now accompanied by her maid, Pimple, who's wearing the old-fashioned dress her father prefers. At this point, Kate learns about Tony's prank and laughs at Marlowe's belief that he is in an inn. Pimple says that Marlowe mistook Kate for the inn's barmaid. Hearing this, Kate also says that she will take advantage of this mistake, which will enable him to talk to her without such shyness. Now, in the inn, Kate pretends to be a maid. She speaks to Marlowe in the accent of a lower class woman. Marlowe finds her beautiful and immediately begins to flirt with her. She also tries to kiss her, but Hardcastle walks inside the room and sees them. Now, Hardcastle tells Kate that he is determined to throw Marlowe out of his house. Meantime, Marlowe has just fled the room. Now, Kate pursues her father to give her time to prove him that Marlowe is not what he seems. Act 4 begins with Constance and Hastings planning their elopement. Constance tells Hastings that she has heard Sir Charles will soon be arriving. And Hastings also tells Constance that he has entrusted her box of jewels to Marlowe to keep them safe. Now Marlowe enters. He is congratulating himself on thinking to give the box of jewels to the landlady, who is Mrs. Hardcastle, to keep them safe. Now Hastings enters and Marlowe tells him that he has just given the jewels securely with the landlady. Now Hastings conceals his disappointment that Mrs. Hardcastle has the jewels back and leaves. Now the two friends begin to argue. They have drunk. Hardcastle also says that he would never have predicted the rudeness of Sir Charles' son. Hearing this, Marlowe is confused by this remark, and at that moment, Kate enters. Now, Marlowe begins to understand something, and he asks Kate where they are, and she tells him that they are at Mrs. Hardcastle's house. Marlowe is horrified at his error. Although Kate does not reveal her true identity, she still pretends to be a poor, low class woman. Marlowe announces his departure and Kate weeps at the news. He's touched to see how she cries about him. At this juncture, Tony and Constance discuss her plan to elope with Hastings even without the jewels. Mrs. Hardcastle enters and the two cousins pretend to flirt so that she won't suspect the planned elopement. Now, a letter comes from Hastings addressed to Tony, but because Tony cannot read, he's an illiterate, his mother reads it to him. The letter reveals the plan of the elopement. Mrs. Hardcastle is now furious and tells Constance that she is sending her far away to Aunt Pedigree's house. Hastings enters and yells at Tony for giving away the secret. The same time, Marlowe also enters and yells at Tony and Hastings for deceiving him about where he is. Constance is distraught and begs Hastings to stay faithful to her even if they have to wait several years to marry. Now, after Constance leaves, Tony tells Hastings to meet him in the garden in 2 hours. Act 5 begins as Hardcastle and the newly arrived Sir Charles laugh together over Marlowe's having mistaken the home for an inn. Hardcastle says that he has seen Marlowe and Kate together and says that they are willing to marry. Marlowe enters and formally apologizes to Hardcastle. Hardcastle says it doesn't matter since Marlowe and Kate will soon marry. But Marlowe denies having feelings for Kate. When Hardcastle refuses to believe him, Kate enters and assures the two fathers that Marlowe likes her. Now she tells the two fathers to hide behind a screen in half an hour to see a proof of Marlowe's feelings. Now out in the garden, Tony arrives and tells Hastings that he has driven his mother and Constance in a circle instead of taking them to Aunt Pedigree's house. Mrs. Hardcastle is terrified, thinking they are lost in dangerous territory. Hastings rushes off to find Constance. Hastings also tries to convince Constance to elope with him. She says that she's too exhausted from the stress of the night to run off. She also explains their situation to Hardcastle and hope that he can influence his wife to allow their marriage. Now inside the house, Hardcastle and Sir Charles hide behind a screen to watch Marlowe's feelings for Kate. Kate is no longer pretending to be a barmaid but speaks in her normal voice. Marlowe says that he wishes he could stay with her, but he does not want to disappoint his family by marrying someone of lower birth. Now, Kate tells him that she has the same background as the women he came to see. Marlowe now kneels before her, and the two fathers burst out from behind the screen, asking why he lied to them about his feelings for Kate. Just then, Marlowe learns Kate's true identity and is embarrassed again at having been so deceived. Mrs. Hardcastle and Tommy enter. Now, Mrs. Hardcastle, having realized where she is, Mrs. Hardcastle says that Constance and Hastings have run off together but is consoled by the fact that she will get to have Constance's jewels. And at that point, Hastings and Constance enter. Sir Charles recognizes Hastings and tells Hardcastle that he is a good man. Now, Hardcastle asks Tony if he is really sure that he doesn't want to marry his cousin. Tony also affirms that it doesn't matter or he does not like to marry Constance. And one reason is that he has not become 21 and so he cannot marry Constance. But Hardcastle, that is Mrs. Hardcastle, has hiding the fact that Tony is in fact already 21. At this point, Tony says that he will not marry Constance and he frees to marry Hastings and Constance and also give them their fortune. Now, everyone except Mrs. Hardcastle is thrilled that the two young couples, Hastings and Constance, get each other's hand, and Marlowe and Kate get each other's hands. The summary of the play is over. Now let's look into the epilogue one. Goldsmith has likely written this epilogue being spoken by the actress playing Kate. Epilogue compares life to a 5-act play and describes a play about the barmaid whom Kate was pretending to be. Now, in the first act, as a barmaid, begins her life shy and nervous and hoping to be hired to work at a country inn. And in the second act, she gains confidence as she presides over a bar in the countryside. And in the third act, she moves to town where she begins to have lovers and enjoy a busy social life while working. And in the fourth, she marries someone with money and begins to aspire to be fashionable and sophisticated. Final act, she grows old and passes her time playing cards. And in the first epilogue, she concludes that since the play is over, all that is left is for the barmaid to plead that the audience reward the playwright for approving of the play they have just watched. Let's look into the epilogue 2. This epilogue was written by Joseph Craddock, which is the actor playing Tony's role. So, this provides an account of Tony's life after the main action of the play ends. Tony, the reporter of the epilogue, marries bed bouncer and decides to move to the town. There, they live a rowdy existence and throw their money around buying art and clothing, and they are eager to prove that they are just as good as those who live in the city. The themes discussed in this play are mistakes and deception, class, love, fashion. The symbols used in this play are clothing and inns. Hope this video helps. If you have query, please write them, and if you have any suggestion to make videos, write them too. Thank you for listening.